from a lot of different places. La Trobe University, Rhodes, Stellenbosch, DUT, all a chaotic jungle of associations. And sometimes I find my work a little bit too depressing. And one of those times is when I'm working on genocides, because as a general person who works on the field of violence and social justice, the theme of genocides keeps coming up. And it's come up a lot in the last 2.5 years. And I've done several pieces on specifically looking at Israel-Palestine, looking at the genocide in Gaza. And now I'm kind of reaching the point as we see the perhaps completion of the first stage of the genocide in Gaza and the move from kind of physical annihilation to the erasure of the 3,500 years of culture and society of Gaza. I'm kind of zooming out and looking at how we can think about genocides in general as a bigger problem. Okay, so let's do this quick. Okay, so 2 quotes. The first one, who after all speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians? Okay, and this is Adolf Hitler in 1939, just before he invades Poland. Okay, and the word genocide does not exist in 1939. It was invented after that, and it was invented precisely because of what Hitler was about to do between 1939 and 1945. But the Armenian genocide, which he's referring to, which had happened just a little earlier, is interesting to him because of the fact that it does not resonate in people's mind. That within Europe there is not a sustained concern about the Armenian genocide, and he takes this to mean something very specific. He takes this to mean that therefore, if he commits a future genocide, no one will really mind. Okay, but I think this, who after all speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians, is a really important idea about the memory and legitimation of genocide. Okay, I want to contrast that with a book that was published last year, Omar al-Akkad's book, which is called One Day Everyone Will Always Have Been Against This. And the title of the book comes from this full quote, which is, one day when it's safe, when there's no personal downside to calling a thing what it is, when it's too late to hold anyone accountable, everyone will always have been against this. Okay, and the striking contrast between Hitler's confidence, who speaks about the Armenian genocide, and al-Akkad's sense that in the future there will be a moment when people look back on the Gaza genocide and will all somehow regret it in a way that they did not regret it at the time. Okay, so I'm coming into this with 3 different questions that have been brewing in my mind over the last year or 2. Firstly, why did I learn about the Holocaust before I learned about colonial genocides? Second question is, why are there such completely different, opposing, contradictory accounts of the genocide in Gaza? And third, why are there such stark differences between the representation of the genocide in Gaza and other concurrent genocides such as Sudan? And all of these kind of coalesce around the central question that I'm interested in today, which is what happens with the representation, non-representation, or anti-representation of genocides. Okay, so it's hard to imagine, I think, if you're a young person today, how radically historically new what has happened in the last 2.5 years has been that the idea of a live stream genocide, the idea of a genocide, can I just check that the Teams meeting is actually up and running and people are in it and it's working? Okay. Okay, good. Okay, sorry about that. I just suddenly had a panic about that because I can't see it on the screen. Okay. Live stream genocide. This was something that was not historically possible before because the technologies of it did not exist. That a live stream genocide depends on the existence of widespread adoption of cell phones. That cell phones have video recording devices, and that it's possible for end users to upload media instantly onto social media platforms. A generation ago, none of those existed, okay? And rather, it was actually incredibly difficult to research genocide. I mean, I remember us working on the Rwandan genocide for years and years and years, having to get interviews with survivors, transcribing them, analyzing them, different people, having to build up an account in retrospect of what happened in the Rwandan genocide, as opposed to simply just having this in your media feeds every single day. Okay. And what interests me within this kind of historical possibility of having access to the live streaming of a genocide is that there are three fundamental different reactions that people had. And that these fundamental reactions also relate to the kind of technologies of social media. Okay, the first thing is most people in the world chose not to access that information. And that's really easy to do. The nature of the user participation in the construction of your algorithms is that simply by not paying attention to something, by not responding to it, by not pausing on it, you construct your future algorithm to ignore that information. So although this information was widely available, and although apparently 1 billion people shared, there's 1 billion people or 1 billion increments of information were shared about the Gaza genocide. That means that another 6 billion didn't, okay, the vast majority of people. And so one of the things one can do with this information is not know it, actively participate in rather not having that information, which is usually kind of argued in the sense of like, well, that's a way of looking after my mental health. That's a way of, that information is so upsetting, so distressing, that in order for me to carry on functioning normally, I need to not have that information. So it's a kind of a self-protective mechanism of not knowing. But there's another thing going on, which those of you who have been following those streams will see that there are these kind of, there's this radical contestation of the account. So every time someone would post something about what was happening in Palestine, there would be a massive replies of people denying it, claiming it was fake. You know, these like Pallywood, this is just like that they're constructing the information as being false. And this, once again, is very normal for genocide. So there's always a pattern of genocide denial. Genocide denial is a historical problem. But when you look at the kind of online postings and online commentary, especially, you see a very, very active, not avoidance, but denial of saying this information exists, but this information is false, okay? And then the third category is the category of engagement. And a lot of people became very engaged, a minority, but a large minority of people became very engaged, became very active in reposting stuff, became active in like social activism, protests, boycotts, So the third reaction to this information is a kind of social engagement reaction and a media engagement reaction, which I think is it's interesting to contrast and to ask the question, what's going on with the people who engage versus the people who deny versus the people who avoid? What are these different things about? Okay, so at the heart of it, I think we've got the problem, which is a problem essentially of all of my work in recent years, is contestation of narratives, that different people look at the same thing and understand it differently and interpret it differently and fundamentally disagree about what is actually going on in the world, okay? And in this sense, genocides are like most other kinds of violence in that they are contested. And typically, the most classic example of way in which violence is contested is that perpetrators deny their violence and victims try to present accounts of the violence. So there's vested interests. Perpetrators want their violence to be hidden so that they don't get held responsible, and victims want their violence to be known so that they can be supported, protected, that there can be some kind of justice. And that's essentially what court cases are about. That's why, people get charged with violent acts, acts of interpersonal violence, acts of criminal violence. That's why states go to the International Court of Justice, South Africa charging Israel with the crime of genocide at the International Court of Justice, so that the claims can be tested. The assertions versus the denials can be weighed against the evidence. And this is a kind of an ongoing feature of most violence. But the interesting thing then is this fact that most people don't want to know. There's this kind of the majority position is people don't want to know about stuff. It's easier not to know than to know. Okay. So what we see going on is, on the one hand, this kind of avoidance syndrome. On the other hand, we've got the assertion that acts of violence are taking place. On the other hand, we've got the denial of the acts of violence or a counter story about the acts of violence. But what's interesting about that is typically the ability of any person or any group to describe violence and to have that description taken seriously and responded to is unequal in society. Some people's stories of their violent victimization has a kind of authority and status and ability to circulate, and some people's doesn't. Some people are kind of rendered silent, voiceless by broader systems of social inequality that we need to look at. And I think we need to think very deeply about what goes on in the mechanisms that allow certain things to be circulated and the mechanisms that cause certain things to be silenced. Okay, so to go back to my first question is, why did I learn about the Holocaust before other genocides? It was several years after learning about the Holocaust that I even knew that other genocides had happened in history. And this is really weird thing, that the Holocaust kind of defines the Western idea of a genocide. And in fact, for many people, those two are the same. And for many people, they say, oh, but there's not a genocide in Gaza because Gaza doesn't look like the Nazi Holocaust. They're not the same kind of death camp. There's social differences between what's going on. And the idea of genocide is so embedded in the single historical event, the 1939-1945 Nazi Holocaust, that it becomes impossible to imagine different genocides. And certainly one of the reasons it's so important is because literally the Holocaust is where the term genocide comes from. It did not exist until the Second World War. There was no word in English, genocide. It had to be made up by sticking two other words together. And it was made by this legal scholar, a Polish Jewish legal scholar, Raphael Lemkin, who developed a kind of a theory and a concept of genocide, and was also kind of an activist in trying to get the new emerging international law, the post-Second World War system of international law that was to try and prevent the kind of atrocities of World War II happening again. He tried to have written into that law a convention around genocide, and this was ultimately successful. So when we think of the kind of basis at least in international law, we have the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And that definition is still the definition that is largely used, for instance, at the case of Israel's genocide in Gaza in the International Court of Justice. That there are specific criteria that are identified as meeting the threshold, the legal threshold for conviction of genocide. But it also led to a huge research field of genocide studies. And there are now journals of genocide studies and departments of genocide studies. So all of this happened, but none of this existed in that form before the Nazis. What's interesting is our current idea, certainly the kind of Western idea of the Holocaust, didn't emerge immediately. It kind of got assembled in the 1960s and onwards. That the things we think of, those images of the death camps, those images of survivors, the movies like Schindler's List, all of those are sort of late, were assembled later as an imaginative representation, and came to have a certain form and a certain kind of apparatus, like a certain like an international network of Holocaust museums and things like that, a Holocaust literature, a Holocaust cinematography, that is now familiar to most of us today. Okay, but something else happened a bit later on, and this is linked to the rise of the internet in the 1990s in the US. As people started networking online for the very first time, there was a rise of a neo-Nazi white supremacist movement in the United States. So suddenly, the neo-Nazism, which had been wholly discredited after the Second World War, started becoming this kind of emergent social movement that people started wanting to get on board with again. And so we started seeing the rise of neo-Nazi movements in the United States, then more recently across Europe and other countries, and most recently sort of as an integral part of American politics and an integral part of Trumpism even. You have like these Proud Boys and other neo-Nazi groups. And one of their defining characteristics of this emergent movement is active Holocaust denialism. That one of the core things they mobilize around is that either the Holocaust never happened or it didn't happen like they say. And you'll get these claims like there weren't even 6 million Jews in Europe. So you'll get this kind of denialism. But what's interesting about that, when you look at it, is often the Holocaust denialist white supremacists are also Zionists. They also really like the idea of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine and the establishment of what they consider to be a European state in the Middle East. And that is because of their white supremacism, because much as they despise Jews, they think that Jews are more white than Arabs. And it's a simple kind of hierarchy of whiteness versus non-whiteness. And so their commitment to the colonial Zionist project is a commitment to really the colonization of the Middle East. And so what on the surface looks like a contradiction is actually completely intelligible from an ethnic supremacist standpoint. But of course, another thing we've seen happen is that Holocaust denialism specifically has been criminalized in many places, and also it has been very powerfully associated with anti-Semitism. So it's hard to separate the idea of Holocaust denialism with hatred and prejudice towards Jewish people in general. And there's many, arguably very good reasons for doing that. But when we think about it, there's also, what's interesting is that this is one of the few denialisms that is criminalized. In most other situations, it's the assertion of the genocide that is criminalized. So, for instance, work on the Congo genocide was banned, in Belgium, and work and speaking about the Armenian genocide is banned in Turkey. So often these states or social apparatuses that are implicated in the genocides, or the actors behind it, criminalize speaking about the genocide. The Holocaust is one of the few historical examples where there's a criminalization of denying the genocide. So when we look at it, it's even more complicated than that, because it's not simply just a matter of, well, Holocaust denialists versus Holocaust acknowledgers. It's the way in which Holocaust narrative functions. And one of the key ways it functions is when we think about the Nazi death camps, we think about the genocide of European Jews, okay? Generally, in popular culture, people don't think about why the death camps were originally developed, that they were originally targeted at people with disabilities, they were originally targeted at political dissidents, at gender minorities. And in fact, the Nazis were the first people to sort of go after trans people. So it's one of the kind of historically documented early instances of what is now the kind of Western right-wing kind of trans-bashing movement. And a range of ethnic minorities other than Jews, Roma people. So we start seeing that although the death camps had a very broad net, and actually the process of racial purification, the process of kind of genetically cleansing Europe for this master race, really started, first of all, with people who identified as having disabilities, not people having particular ethnicities. But because of, once again, racial hierarchy, they started going after people on the racial hierarchy, of which Jewish people were only one group, a very big group and a very significant group, and by the end of it, the major group. But there's a kind of erasure of the complexity of that violence. And this uneven representation is really important to think about deeply, okay? Because there's a kind of a contradiction in here, okay? To be in a group of people that is a victim of a genocide, that group has to be a relatively marginalized group. Because if they're not, if they're a powerful group, they'll simply, you can't genocide people who are as powerful as you. You've got to be able to overwhelm them with military strength, social power, legitimacy. And genocides don't primarily only work on military strength, they work on legitimation. That before genocides happen, there's a legitimation of violence against certain groups. It's not just like, well, we can. There's a like, we should, and underneath the kind of genocidal system. And so that the we should part requires the ability to inscribe certain groups of people as less than human, of not having a right to life, as being a threat to the society. So we see all of that going on. So because to be in a genocide victim group, you have to be relatively powerless. That also means you have less power to represent the genocide that is being enacted against you. Okay. And this is one of the problems which leads to erasure of most genocides. That the people who are being genocided don't have the ability to represent their suffering back into the social system that makes it possible. But with the Holocaust, there was a very powerful movement of a combination of Jewish victimization and Jewish social power that made it possible to mobilize the inscription of the Holocaust as the kind of exemplary genocide. And not only did that happen, but at the same time, something else really interesting happened, is that anti-Semitism became the kind of symbol of racism within the West. That the idea that anti-Semitism was like the most egregious, the worst form of racism that was possible, and more reprehensible than other forms of racism. Okay, so this leads us to my other starting question, which is, why did I not know about colonial genocides when I was a kid? Why at high school didn't I know that Western colonialism was intrinsically genocidal? That genocidal wasn't an occasional aberration. It was methodologically structural to colonization, the process of ethnically cleansing people from their land, seizing their land, subjugating them, or destroying their entire categories of people, okay? And one of the reasons for that is because of the way colonialism was inscribed within kind of Western education system, which is that colonialism was presented as a positive project, wasn't presented as a project of dispossession, land theft, racism, genocidal, mass violence. It was represented as a project of civilization, of taking everything that is wonderful about the West, science, medicine, Christianity, and bringing it to these ungrateful heathens of the rest of the world, and then being absolutely shocked when they resisted this process. Okay, but intrinsic to that, intrinsic to the colonial genocidality, is the idea that the victims of colonialism were not people, okay? And we see this kind of happening again and again, the stripping of human status from the subjects of colonization. And the colonizers saying repeatedly that the land they're colonizing is uninhabited. This is one of the crazy sort of repetitive frames of colonialism. Oh, it's uninhabited, so we can take it. Of course, the land is inhabited. The reason they're able to say that is because they regard it as not inhabited by people of the same category as themselves. And of course, the big problem is that colonized people didn't have the ability to represent their experiences back into the colonial system. But we do sometimes see this breaking down. And the two sites that broke down quite significantly were one on slavery, that the kind of genocidal dehumanization of slavery became contested by people in the West, by some Christians started having an anti-slavery kind of activism, and eventually the ability of the colonial system of slavery to justify itself collapsed. I mean, of course, Marxists will argue that it was also no longer economically the best system, but we can have both of those explanations at the same time. And the other place it collapsed was around the Congo genocide, that is very late in the Western colonialism process. I mean, that was that continued into the beginning of the 20th century. And then once again, there were some journalists, some religious activists who started representing the Congo genocide back to Europe, and it led to this legitimation crisis. It's really worth reading the book King Leopold's Ghost. If you want to understand anything about colonialism at all, to have a look at that book, to look at the ways in which violence was justified and the ways in which it became contested, and the way in which that contestation actually eventually escalated to the point where the legitimation narrative just can't function anymore, or at least not in that way. It has to find a new way of functioning. Okay. Now, one of the interesting things about this is that this story that leaves out the genocidal nature of colonialism. That says colonialism is really nice, and it brought all these nice science, medicine, Christianity to the world. That the success of that story leads to another notion of genocide, which is the idea that Western civilization is now under threat. And if you look at what the kind of discourses around Trumpism, discourses around European nationalism, this is a big deal. Like, white people in the West are freaking out, some of them, about like the end of Western civilization. Okay. And what they mean by that is like multiculturalism, diversity, equity, and inclusion, the economic decline of the United States and Europe as kind of places of material privilege, all of this, and what this kind of paranoia about the decline of Western civilization emerges as is a kind of a narrative of white genocide. And I think this white genocide narrative is one of the most interesting because it's one of the most deranged of all genocide narratives. And of course, South Africa is central in white genocide narratives because a lot of the way a lot of its contemporary articulation is around stories of white farm murders. So for the kind of international white supremacist movement, this mythology that white farmers are being murdered in huge numbers because of their whiteness, okay, and that this constitutes an actual genocide of white people in South Africa. This idea, which you've all heard of this story being told. And it's not just a story that gets told. At a certain, like in about 2018, Australia, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, he was like, we're going to give South African farmers special visas because of the white genocide in South Africa. And then Trump last year started giving white farmers special visas at exactly the same time. And this is what I want you to know, at exactly the same time that ICE was involved with an ethnic cleansing of people of color in the United States. At exactly the point that ICE is killing Central and South American migrants, Trump was wanting to import white people from Africa and import them under the guise of saving them from the white genocide. Okay, so where does this bullshit come from? I mean, it doesn't just fall out of the sky. This is produced over literally 100 years. This white genocide story. And it goes back to the long history of the idea of racial replacement. Okay, and racial replacement, one of the landmark texts of it, it didn't start from nowhere. It built up from like 18th century kind of evolutionary theory, racial hierarchy theory, eugenics theory. But this dude, Madison Grant, this white American fascist, wrote this book called The Passing of the Great Race, 110 years ago, okay? And here, what he's saying is like, well, kind of white Western people are kind of on the decline, and all these other brown people, black people, they're all just breeding, and we've got a genetic genocide happening. Now, this is different from a military genocide. This is not like people getting sent to death camps. This is a genocide by population shift. Okay, Now, what's interesting about Madison's book is that Hitler personally wrote to Madison and thanked him for the book and described it as his Bible. Like literally Adolf Hitler described Madison's book as his Bible. So this is a very influential text. And those of you who think that, it's kind of Nazi ideology comes from Europe, in fact, it comes from the United States. And it comes from the kind of post-slavery moment of the United States and gets exported to Europe. And this movement kind of escalates and escalates and escalates. I mentioned that it then takes off with the online neo-Nazi movement in the 1990s. And then this guy, Renaud Camus, writes The Great Replacement book, which also becomes a kind of a handbook of this racial replacement theory, okay? And this becomes the basis for like anti-migrant movements all over Europe and the United States, and the rise of these white nationalist political parties in Europe, the AfD in Germany, neo-Nazi parties now the biggest party in Germany, Trumpism, of course, Trumpism, ICE, the incredibly violent ethnic cleansing of migrants from everywhere except Europe. All of this is part of this, but one of the places it becomes really clear is in the manifestos of mass killers. So in 2011, we have this guy in Norway who shoots 76 people and goes to this kind of the summer camp of a progressive political party. He's just killing kids. It's a massive, biggest mass violence event since the Second World War in Europe. Actually, that's not true, but kind of. And he's got he's part of, he writes this very elaborate manifesto, and at the heart of his manifesto is this idea of racial replacement, and this as being the kind of apocalypse for white supremacists. And similarly, then in Christchurch in New Zealand in 2019, this Australian dude goes into 2 mosques, fully armed, automatic weapons, and he adds an innovation to his mass killing. He's the first live streaming mass shooter, okay? So from when he leaves home, gets in his car, he's live streaming his actions, and the live streams of the murder of 51 people in 2 mosques in Christchurch, it was on the internet. But he also wrote a manifesto about this. And his manifesto starts with the words, with the words, it's the birth rates, it's the birth rates, it's the birth rates. For him, his entire worldview that made it necessary in his mind to murder Muslim people was about the fact that Muslim people and all people of color around the world have increasing populations, and white people have decreasing populations. And this is going to lead to the replacement of the white race. It's going to lead to the collapse of Western civilization. And for them, this is articulated as a white genocide. So when, farm murder WhatsApp groups start like babbling about genocide, you've got to understand it within this entire cosmology, and why South African white farm murders function for people in the United States and Europe as being kind of evidence that not only is there a kind of a genetic decline of whiteness, there's an actual physically violent genocidal impulse against whiteness. And this then becomes one of the reasons why, Trump has to bomb Iran in the very near future. So, and I don't know if any of you saw a week ago, who was the guy who had the recolonization speech? It wasn't J.D. Vance, or was it? But one of the top American people, not Trump, gave a speech that I think it was Vance actually, where he basically reasserted that United States essentially needs to engage in. Hey? It was Rubio. Yeah, it was Rubio. gave this speech saying that the United States needs to go into a recolonization phase, precisely because of this, precisely to re-establish Western civilization and whiteness over the world. And it needs to assert the fact that it is the biggest army in human history, and it has the power to wage colonialism against the rest of the world. And it should do that. That is not a bad thing. These are people who are trying to bring back the civilizing version of narrative of colonialism. Which brings us then to this question, the question of Gaza. And these two different accounts of Gaza that we see being thrown around. The one is Israel has a right to defend itself. Okay, so there's this idea of Israel as this tiny little nation, the only Jewish nation in the world, surrounded by this great sea of Arab nations, that these European Jews return to their ancestral land to find a place of safety after the Holocaust, and these Arab savages just attack them. Okay, this is an essential core colonial narrative. It's a core of every single colonial narrative, is the white folks just arrived and they just wanted to be nice, and they just wanted to farm, and they just wanted to do some mining, and they just wanted to develop the place and raise the standard of living and build an infrastructure. And the damn indigenous people just want to fight always. Okay. And this is a very, very consistent narrative. And it's inexplicable to them that people wouldn't want to be enslaved, wouldn't want to be murdered by the colonizers, wouldn't want to be relegated to subhuman status, wouldn't want their land to be stolen, wouldn't want their livelihoods to be destroyed. This is just enigmatic to the kind of white colonial mindset. And attempts to resist it just seem to be evidence of their fundamental colonial belief, which is that white colonial folks are civilizing and indigenous folks are violent, primitive, and savage. That is the core of all of it. But this plays out in the case of Gaza. Okay, so Israel is just trying to defend itself as it's been trying to defend itself for 77 years. From these attacks by these other countries, these rockets from Gaza, this Hezbollah trying to, shoot missiles at them, versus the other account, which is like, this is a Western colonial project started in the 1920s. It was always a violent project. It was always that it introduced systematic terrorism into the Middle East by these Zionist terrorist groups that were ethnically cleansing part of Palestine before the state of Israel even formed in 1948, that this was going on. And that is intrinsically violent. It is in its essence an ethnic cleansing project, and it is structurally genocidal. That the specific genocide in Gaza may be new to post 7th of October, but that Zionism is always in the very structure of its coloniality and ethnic cleansing is quintessentially genocidal. Okay, but people just can't get a way of agreeing about this, and this is what's really interesting. Okay, is that you cannot convince Zionists. Well, you can convince some of them, and you should watch the movie Israelism. It's a really interesting movie about Zionists becoming anti-Zionist and why that happened. And it's a movie made by young American Zionists who grew up being like, Israel's going to save the Jewish people, and then having this kind of aha moment where they're like, this is bullshit. I've been lied to. This is a fundamentally unethical, violent society that's denying people human rights. And that transition is really interesting. But sometimes that transition is possible, and it seems of Jewish young Americans, sort of 18 to 25, university student age, are mostly not Zionists anymore. They were, and now they're not. Whereas we still see like dramas like King David School versus Rodin, that Zionism is very, very alive and well in certain sectors of South Africa, but not in the way that it is in places like the US, the UK, and Germany, where if you even say the word Zionism, you get, I mean, genocide, you get fired from your job, you get fired from academic jobs, you know, all kinds of other positions. That there's a kind of a radical, violent suppression of articulation of the genocide in Gaza. And what this brings us to is this fundamental problem, is that just seeing facts doesn't necessarily change people's minds. That is it Barry Weiss who did that interview recently where she says, like, you know, I keep trying to explain to people why Zionism is good, but they just are hearing it through these piles of dead children's bodies. And she's like, damn it, we've got to get rid of people seeing those children's bodies because it's making them not believe us that Zionism is awesome. And what's interesting about that, she doesn't see the problem with the children's dead bodies. For her, it's simply it's an impediment to her sales pitch. It's not an ethical problem of dead humans. Okay, and it brings us to the fact that the problem, that the way in which meaning is structured by the broader interpretative frameworks, which is why it's South Africa that takes Israel to the International Court of Justice, not any other country in the world. And that countries like Germany actually opposed and went in to defend Israel. And the United States is engaged in this massive process of criminalizing speaking out against the Gaza genocide. And Australia has just adopted a whole kind of university thing where it's like, oh, if you make Zionists uncomfortable, that's a breach of like university rules and civility and grounds for whatever. I don't even know what the punishments are going to be. Okay, so what we're seeing is essentially that colonizers don't think there's a genocide in Gaza, and colonized people do. That the world's really split on that, not purely and simply, but as a tendency. And South Africa as being the other apartheid state. These two apartheid states founded in 1948 on racial hierarchy. South Africa is the first to recognize right back in 2023 that what's going on is just under international law is in fact a genocide. But what's interesting is that the interpretative frameworks are so much the interpretative frameworks of colonialism, either the colonizers' interpretative framework or the colonized people's interpretative framework, and that this fundamentally changes how people experience information about Gaza in the last 2.5 years. And when we look at it, there's interesting kind of sort of intersection of psychological and discursive processes going on. And one of the things that we can see, not only kind of, psychodynamic things like disavowal, like just simply working out how to just not know something that is in front of your eyes, but also mechanisms of projection, okay? And so what happens is that the West and Zionist discourse in general takes the idea of Western anti-Semitism, which goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. It goes back a millennium, and projects that onto the Middle East, and sort of tries to get rid of its own shame and knowledge of its anti-Semitism by creating this new post-war narrative that, oh, anti-Semitism is something that Arab people do. And this becomes a very powerful foundation of Zionist discourse. In fact, this idea of Arab anti-Semitism, which of course is nonsense, because Jewish people weren't persecuted in Arab and Persian countries in the way that they were in Europe. In fact, it was so that they were so not persecuted that in the 1950s, Zionists had a fundamental problem, is that people didn't want to move from Middle Eastern countries to Israel. So they had to go and bomb synagogues and stuff in places like Iran. That this was like a, early Zionist sort of military intelligence operations, that they had to go, that actually had to go and threaten the lives of Jewish people happily settled in Iran to make them believe that there was an anti-Semitic threat to them and they should thus move to Israel. And so this construction of the anti-Semitic terrorist Arab then kind of reaches its pinnacle in like 1980s, 1990s Hollywood, where the idea of terrorism, which until then had mainly been used to talk about the IRA in Ireland, then gets mapped into this kind of this Hollywood figure of this kind of hysterical Arab terrorist. And of course, 9/11 just clinches it. 9/11 is the kind of nail in the coffin, where everything that is wrong can be blamed on the idea of Islamic terrorism, ignoring the fact that Al-Qaeda, folks behind 9/11, were actually a CIA project that were kind of engineered to try and fight the Soviets in Afghanistan so that the US could retain control over oil. And they didn't want to get into a direct war with the Soviet Union. They were like, oh, well, if we radicalize Muslims and give them weapons, they will fight the communists because communists are atheists. And so we'll start a war there. And of course, as always happens, when people do that, the insurgent groups that they indoctrinate and arm then kind of become independent and go rogue. And then we have 9/11 happening. Okay, so it takes us to a really interesting specific point in the construction of these narratives, which is why it was necessary to lie about October 7th. This is a really interesting question to me. October 7th was a catastrophe. The Hamas attacks on Israeli settlements on the music festival is a disaster. And also a crime under international law. I mean, this is attacks on civilians. This is a war crime. And the taking of civilian hostages. This is a crime against humanity. They just need to say that happened. They just need to say, well, civilians were attacked and civilians were taken hostage, and then they could have gotten UN permission to go after Hamas, to launch an actual a military operation. But they chose not to do that. And instead, what they did is there was this kind of massive propaganda spamming of these stories of beheaded babies. You remember that, the 40 beheaded babies of October 7th. And then another set of stories about this kind of psychotic, sadistic sexual violence. So this account of 7th of October is not an account of a military operation in which civilians were illegally targeted and hostages were illegally abducted. It becomes a kind of this kind of account of unimaginable cruelty and sadism and savagery. And that is the point. That it is the transition from breaching international law to a kind of deranged savagery. That is why these lies have to be created and why they have to be propagated, because this is what mobilizes the justification of colonial violence. This is the thing that says, well, we're not even dealing with human beings here. Therefore, we don't have to treat them as human beings. Therefore, we don't have to obey international law. Therefore, we don't have to proceed by the restrictions of human rights. We can just do whatever we want at this point. And it also does another really important kind of work, okay? which is that it erases what the actual, some of the fundamental problems around the using 7th of October to legitimate a genocide. The first is that they knew the attack was coming. They knew for months. They've been told by Egyptian intelligence, they've been told by their own intelligence, and they suppressed that information. And they stood down troops from the Gaza border, the most securitized border in the world. They sent them to the West Bank, and in the morning of the attacks, they stood down their own soldiers for like 5 hours. Not only that, but that Netanyahu had for several years been actively telling people, and like not in secret, like on TV, saying to people, if you want to support Israel, you must support Hamas. Like going on TV and saying those words, and then organizing the transfer of like $1.4 billion from Qatar to Hamas. Okay, so all of these get erased in this like account of savagery. And of course, the other thing that gets erased is how the military then responded. And the fact that a large number, and perhaps the majority, we don't know, we can't really find out, of the Israelis that were killed by Israeli forces, that they invoked this illegal under international law military principle that Israel has, which is that if some of your people are getting taken hostage, you should kill them rather. And that's a contravention of basic principles of international law. But that they invoked the Hannibal Directive, that most of the vehicles that were taking people back over the Gaza border were bombed by Israeli helicopter gunships, that the houses that were blown up by Israeli tanks. So many Israelis were killed by the Israeli forces knowingly and deliberately. And that's a fundamental political problem for the kind of Likud leadership in Israel. But also that it's necessary to undermine the intelligibility of what to Israel is 7th of October and to Palestinians is the Al-Aqsa flood, which was that this was a carefully constructed military operation with very specific purpose. And that intelligibility needs to be removed from it, because the issue that was used to justify the genocide proceeding for 2 years was the issue of the hostages. Well, we have to have a genocide to free the hostages, despite the fact that the genocide killed many of the hostages. But it erases the obvious intelligibility of the fact that Israel was the one with hostages. Israel at any point has between 3,000 and 6,000 Palestinian hostages, which never get talked about. And that those hostages are kept under conditions of torture. And that one of the functions of this illegal act of taking civilian hostages was to organize a hostage swap and to say, we're going to take a bunch of your people hostage, and we'll release them as soon as you release our hostages. Okay, the Palestinian hostages held by Israel. That has to be erased, because that doesn't help the colonial narrative. That makes the Al-Aqsa flood seem like an intelligible act, not an act of barbarism. And so that has to be wiped out. And it has to be wiped out because the Palestinian resistance has to be constructed as not only savage, not only as primitive, not only as barbaric, but as genocidal. And this is where you see the links between construction of white genocide and construction of Zionist genocide. That a core mechanism of Zionist narratives is that Palestinian resistance to occupation and dispossession, the general Middle Eastern resistance to occupation and dispossession, is not simply decolonial resistance. It is in fact anti-Jewish genocide. And that's why they freak out about globalize the Intifada and from the river to the sea, claiming that these liberation slogans are in fact anti-Jewish genocidal slogans. Okay, so it's really important for Zionism to sell itself to the West, to construct the Zionist project as being an attempt to make Jewish people safe against the threat of genocide in the Middle East, which is exactly how apartheid justified itself, if you remember. Like white people, I was told every day at school that if South Africa became a democracy, there would just be like white people would be driven into the sea. I mean, that was such a weird turn of phrase. Like, why drive them into the sea? Why not just shoot them in the back of their heads? Anyway, but that was the story. And that the communists were going to come and kill your grandmother in her bed. It was like really psychotic bullshit. But white people kind of believe this, okay? And Zionists believe that they are just trying to be safe in their ancestral lands, and all these genocidal Arabs want to kill them. And without that, the entire project falls to the ground because it just becomes a violent colonial land theft, ethnic cleansing, and genocide project. But what is interesting about it is they lost control of the legitimation narrative on TikTok. Not really so much on Facebook and Instagram, because Meta already had a system of Zionist control of algorithms. But TikTok didn't. TikTok was this free-range space where masses, 300-to-1 Palestinian versus Zionist postings about the genocide. And most of the world was looking at that, and people who bothered engaging with were like, but this is just a genocide. Okay, so the narrative was lost on TikTok. And they freaked out about that. The Zionists freaked out about that, okay? And it became a project to reassert the Zionist narrative as to try and bring back control, which they'd previously had of the Western media. They managed to control the most reputable, independent, critical Western media, you know, BBC, New York Times, Washington Post. All of these were thought of as being the great bastions of reliable Western journalism, and all of them were just pumping out these Zionist accounts. So they really had control of meta algorithms. They needed to get control of the TikTok algorithms. So they literally created this situation where they banned TikTok. And I don't know if you remember, for a day, TikTok was banned last year. And then it was like, okay, we'll unban it if you sell it. If you unbundle US TikTok from global TikTok, sell it to US buyers who then have the control over the TikTok algorithm. Okay, and they specifically sold it to the Zionist consortium led by Larry Ellison, also a kind of a surveillance data tech billionaire from Oracle. Also the biggest donor to the IDF in the world. He's the biggest single donor to the Israeli Defense Force. He is specifically now the power behind TikTok, which is why TikTok, the TikTok algorithm, certainly within the US, is now recouped within a Zionist ideological project. And the project then is to bring specifically Western young people back into Zionist ideology. They don't really care that much about the global South, but it's very, very important, because if the legitimation narrative breaks down, their money stops flowing and their weapons stop flowing. And if the money and the weapons, the external Western supply of money and weapons to the colonial project fails, then the colonial project just implodes overnight. Okay, so I hope this is going to play. We always seem to have problems. What's this woman's name? The Meta Zionist propaganda chief. Anyway, this is. So I don't know if you get how fucking crazy that little speech is, okay? I mean, she literally says, we banned people from saying that Jews control the media. Like, we control the media by banning people who say we control the media. So that's the essence of that speech. But a number of things going on in that speech. So this is the head of Meta, i.e. Facebook and Instagram's Zionist kind of propaganda division, okay? Cutler is her last name, Jordan Cutler or something. Anyway, and one of the important things she's saying is we've changed the things that we disagree with to have been recategorized as not from being mistakes or incorrect information, but being hate speech. So if you describe the genocide in Gaza, they're no longer classifying that as misinformation. They're classifying that as hate speech, which is a much more radical category, which can then thus be eliminated. But of course, the important conceptual work is to collapse anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, to say that anything that is against the Zionist colonial project is intrinsically anti-Semitic, i.e. intrinsically racist, i.e. intrinsically hate speech. Okay, this is the ideological project, and there's a very, very conscious crisis within Zionist ideology that they have to try and bring the Western youth back into Zionist ideology. And the question right now is whether this is going to work. And I don't know the answer to that. I don't know whether they're going to be successful, but there's a good chance they will be. As they were successful with kind of boomer generation in making the entire West pro-Zionist, except for self-conscious political decolonial radicals, okay? And of course, the other thing that's happened, and you see this on your social media if you follow this kind of information, is these massive kind of bot farms that are just reproducing the Hasbro talking point. So the Hasbro is an entire worked out ideology with a handbook of talking points. And initially, sort of Israeli university students were paid to go be online making these talking points on posts that were critical of Zionist colonialism. But now, of course, it can all be automated. Now it can be AI. So the AI can actually understand the post and generate a seemingly appropriate language response that reasserts the Zionist talking points. And I'm sure you've all seen this happen and be like, geez, where all these people who hold these hardcore beliefs come? Well, mostly there's no people there. What there are bots. And the problem with bots is that you can reproduce them much more easily than humans. You can have hundreds of thousands of them. They're very efficient. They don't need to sleep. And you've got it under control of both the richest people in the world, but the people with the best data technology in the world. Okay. So that brings me to my other question. Yeah, so I've talked too much about Gaza in the last 2.5 years. Where is Sudan? Why is there not an equivalent social engagement with the genocide in Sudan? Why does it remain invisible? Why are there not protests with Sudanese flags on the streets? Why are there not seminars about it? Why is it not in the media? Why did South Africa not take the United Arab Emirates to the International Criminal Court for supporting a genocide in Sudan? Like, why is Gaza the kind of object of anti-genocide concern? And a number of other concurrent genocides aren't, okay? And what does that erasure do and what does that erasure mean? And the first thing about it is that Sudan is not really linked to Western interests, okay? And this came out really seriously in Rwanda. It's like one of the responses when the UN people in Rwanda said to the United States, there is a genocide unfolding. The United States response was, what is our strategic interest in Rwanda? And there was none. So they did not acknowledge the genocide, because acknowledging the genocides triggers an international treaty obligation to intervene to stop a genocide. So they were engaged in Rwandan genocide denialism while it was happening. And so 800,000 people were killed because there were no Western interests worth defending there. What they did is they airlifted the white people out, and they just left everyone else to be killed. Okay. Secondly, that Sudan is not embedded in English language global media networks. It's not like it's not in the dominant language of social media, of TikTok, of Instagram, of Facebook. So it doesn't immediately plug into global circuits. It can plug into local circuits and specific information exchanges, but it's not linked that specifically to Western interests, and not to the biggest of, one of the most dominant of Western interests is Western interest in Middle Eastern oil. And the simple fact of the matter that Black lives do not matter in the West. That is, I mean, a lot of the failure to engage with Sudan, failure to engage with Eastern DRC is that human life from the Western media standpoint is on a hierarchy of value. And some lives are very valuable. The lives of American citizens are very valuable if they're white. Otherwise, ICE can do whatever they want. But Black lives don't matter within those systems of meaning and those systems of representation. And this brings me to one of my kind of concluding claim of this analysis, is that the impacts of non-representation are actually as serious as the impacts of active denialism. So Gaza genocide denialism, Holocaust denialism, those kind of denialisms, they have catastrophic social effects, but simply not knowing has equally catastrophic effects. As far as we know, the number of people killed in Sudan is greater than the number of people killed in Gaza. But there's no equivalent ideological apparatus engaged in Sudan genocide denialism. There's just a failure. There's just an empty space where concern about the genocide should be. Which then leads me to another question, that there's a much bigger genocide. There's two, actually. This is very weird. There are two bigger genocides. The one which is a maybe, and the other one which is a definitely coming down the pipe, which is climate catastrophe. So on current predictions, without any change, climate catastrophe is going to end most species on Earth, including the human species. So that's really going to render all other genocides kind of historically insignificant. So why aren't people freaking out about that? Some people are. There are people who are very concerned about it and are doing stuff and are like engaged in kind of activism. But once again, there's a contestation of representation. And the problem is that the people who have the interest, the people who are benefiting from climate disaster, i.e. the fossil fuel industries, are the most powerful and wealthy industries in the world, and thus they have the capacity to control narratives, control media in a way that other ordinary people, particularly people in like Pacific low-lying islands that are going to be the first victims of climate catastrophe. Okay, so once again, you've got a contestation of narrative linked to an inequality on economic power, which is linked to an inequality in the capacity for representation. And you have this highly resourced system of disinformation. So climate disinformation is an entire industry backed by the fossil fuel industry with its own fake scientists and fake publications and websites and all of that stuff. But what's interesting about it is it works not just on denialism, but it works on conspiracy theories. So people who are really caught up in climate change denialism tend to also be caught up in two other ideological systems that support climate change denialism. The one is a general conspiracy theory, a libertarian conspiracy theory about people trying to tell us what to do. people trying to tell us we shouldn't drive our cars and we shouldn't do these nice things which we like doing. We shouldn't eat so much meat. And there's a kind of a libertarian conspiracy theory about this is an attempt to like COVID lockdowns, like vaccinations, as an attempt to lock us into a tyrannical global world order that we have to resist. Okay, and the other thing is a kind of a religious discourse, which says, oh, well, climate change, the world is made by God, and God knows what she's doing, and it's like, so humans don't have to worry about climate change because the big people who make the world and stuff are in control of it. So this is a kind of contested battle, discursive battle, okay, which is on a much bigger scale than any other historical genocide. I mean, like that it's a species-ending genocide. It's also problematic in that the 1948 definition of genocide doesn't cover unintentional genocide. They have to prove the intent for genocide, and you can't prove genocidal intent by Shell and Mobil and those companies. There's simply a lack of concern about genocidal consequences, which, if you remember, that's what got Oscar Pistorius finally sent in jail. Not that he intended to kill someone, but the dolus eventualis legal principle, that he knew that if he did what he did, if he shot 4 bullets through a toilet door, someone would be likely to die, and you're not allowed to do stuff that causes a likely death of people. So in that sense, there can still be accountability. Okay, so final summary. Genocides are rendered easier or more difficult by systems of representation. These systems can entail either non-representation or counter-representation, denialist representation. Contestation often does not depend on factual claims, but on the broader system of meaning in which claims are placed, okay? The colonial system, those kinds of things. These systems need economic resources, technologies, and capacity to generate narratives that mesh with existing ideological systems. And this is one of the problems, is the technological capacity to control people's information, the kind of post-Cambridge Analytica capacity to control what information people are exposed to is transitioning from a very, very primitive totalitarian form to a form we can't yet imagine, and a form in which the whole idea of critical rationality or autonomy of thought may be about to collapse in the next year or two. I mean, this is very serious, this assertion that I'm making, that the combination of AI and psychographic marketing, micro-targeting, and the reach of information beyond simply social media platforms to the point where every single thing from your car to your fridge is collecting data on you. This is going to fundamentally change what it means to be a human, and perhaps end the idea that humans are capable of thinking independently. But at the same time, as that apocalyptic scenario is on the horizon, it's also clear that these things can be contested with counter data and critical analysis. And it's also clear that many people became opposed to Zionist colonialism in the last 2.5 years who weren't opposed to it before. And there's a possibility that people will get concerned about Sudan and will get concerned about Eastern DRC. These are not impossibilities. We've seen them happen. And so the conditions of possibility just need to be understood and brought into being, because they're not going to happen spontaneously. And that's my story for today.
Thank you, Anthony. I don't know when you have to write. Sure. You have time for a question?
I've got time for a few questions, yep. And I would love a few questions, but then I really am going to have to run.
Colin, for the seminar. I found it really interesting, and I will be mindful of time because I have to go to the same place Colin has to go to. But it's not a question so much as a comment that I thought we'd all find quite interesting. Is I like that we brought in the concept of the Holocaust being like a prototype. And then you spoke about why don't we know about colonial genocide. And I think, and you mentioned Lincoln. So all three things I found interesting because I'm doing them in my own thesis. And it sort of goes back to, you link all of it to what happened post-Holocaust. And in the process of the Nuremberg trials, that genocide wasn't actually official in the Nuremberg trials. Convention only came after. And what a lot of people, or where there's a lot of confusion, is that what Lincoln posited to be genocide is not what's in the convention itself. And that stimulates the genocide denialism because what's essentially in the convention is limited to mass killing. And then you find that interesting because in the drawing up of the convention, we had colonial states all about the inclusion of cultural genocide, which you like to colonialism. So I think that all sort of
So the Genocide Convention has this political power struggle. So the colonial powers are like, we've got to exclude colonial genocides from the convention. And the new totalitarian powers, like the Stalinist Soviet Union, are like, you can't include political persecution and as genocide. So it had to be lifted out. Well, obviously, political persecution should be classified as genocide. So there's always this politics. There's always a contestation of power.
Yes, I think that was quite interesting that you brought that in because in making the Holocaust sort of that paradigmatic example of genocide, it in itself is not even, it was never registered as a genocide. And also the defense of the Holocaust never included any cultural ramifications either. So they didn't even include like the destruction of Yiddish post-Holocaust. And so when they're manufacturing the Holocaust as an example, they're manufacturing it as mass killing. And so when things like Palestine happen, they ignore sort of the destruction of schools, churches, that type of town. And also that when Lincoln creates the concept of genocide, it was before what happened in the war. It actually went up from 1939 up until 1946 and included quite a lot of legal policies that weren't aimed at killing. And so that manufacturizing of genocide denial starts from there.
And it's really interesting looking at that and it raises the question, who gets to say what genocide is? Like who has the power to say what genocide is? Who has the power to do a genocide to another group? And who has the power to erase the historical record of that genocide versus who gets the power to create a historical record of their genocide and who doesn't? So these are really kind of fundamentally important questions. Okay, do you want to do one last little question, intervention, something, maybe someone? Are you all?
I particularly like the way you reached back to historical record and reclaimed colonialism as a genocide. Because I think that what it does is it says that when we develop language, manifestations of this thing or this phenomenon that we now have language for doesn't exist from that moment on. We can reach back into history and reframe and reinterpret and make meaning of things that have happened. Because as you rightly pointed out, the narrative about colonialism is always pigmented. People arrived with innocent, good intent. And they occupied land in which there was no people. Both in Africa, various countries in Africa, but also in Palestine. That no one was.
And that the resistance to colonialism is unintelligible. It simply validates the assumption of indigenous people being inherently violent, because there's no other way in which it could be intelligible.
And at its very foundation, we cannot make that distinction. Then the narratives around the denial of genocide in Palestine will forever be perpetuated. I was always also struck by, there were so many things I was struck by, but I was also struck by the use of these terms, the use of these slogans, like from the river to the sea, And also in our context, guilt of war and how that is being reinterpreted and weaponized.
Yeah, so that gets constructed as evidence of white genocide, like one settler, one bullet becomes reinscribed as evidence of a white genocide. Which gets to the heart of this, the fact that genocide narratives are always constructed. They may be relatively accurately constructed or absolutely falsely constructed, but they're always constructed.
I think the effect of those kinds of reinterpretations, I think they're very intentional, is to neuter the effect. To neuter the effect and to immobilize resistance.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Unfortunately, time is against us.